again, we start to tell ourselves an untrue story about our inherently flawed nature. That story causes us to isolate further, and the more we isolate and the more we don't allow ourselves to be seen and to co-regulate with other people, the more we need comfort, the more we need connection, and the more we turn right back to those same maladaptive coping mechanisms in order to soothe ourselves in the absence of interpersonal comfort and true, deep co-regulation. So this is where we end up in a really toxic loop, where we might have no idea how to make the changes we need to make in our lives because the core emotions that we would need access to in order to get out of this loop are inaccessible to us. And the way that we start to reverse this cycle is we learn to get back in touch with those core emotions. And in order to do that, we probably need to work with what Alice Miller, who is a famous late psychologist, would call an enlightened witness. So an enlightened witness is someone like a therapist, an author, a friend who's been through the rounds of their own toxic shame, who's able to give you the type of language for your experiences that you have lacked your entire life. And it's worth noting that at this point in your life where you're becoming aware of this toxic shame patterning, you probably have much more complex experiences than you did when you were 2 years old. So the type of emotional co-regulation you need in order to get back in touch with those core emotions needs to come from someone who has a much more advanced psychological vocabulary, which again is why I think the best person for this job is a really intelligent therapist, not a therapist who is going to treat your symptoms and your symptoms only, but a therapist who is going to help you get in touch with the core emotions that are driving your neurotic or obsessive patterns of thinking and behaving. So the first step in this process of reversing this cycle of toxic shame is to take the inner critic offline as much as possible and learning to observe yourself as a person who makes sense. I really think that the most isolating thought that toxic shame leaves most of us with is the idea that our feelings don't make any sense, when that is not true. Your emotional experience itself, in a raw way, is absolutely identical to the raw emotions that come up for every single person on this planet. We all have the same core emotions at the switchboard. The problem is that you got some wires crossed. You learned to name things incorrectly or to suppress some things for the good of fitting into your early caregiving environment. And then a whole bunch of things that we just talked about snowballed out of that original miscalculation. But the cool news is that you are not inherently broken, flawed, weird, messed up, or any of those things you might be telling yourself at your core. You just developed compensatory mechanism on top of compensatory mechanism for trying to regulate yourself when you did not have access to skills that would help you regulate directly. So one of the first things it can help you to start working through is giving yourself some grace, understanding, and compassion around all of these things that have developed as a result of believing that one or more of the core emotions that everybody has in this world are inherently wrong and that you are bad for feeling it. If you can start to understand how many things grew out of that initial misunderstanding, you're going to be able to give yourself a lot more grace and stop thinking of the patterns of behavior that you're ashamed of as moral flaws and start seeing them for what they are, which is your best attempt at coping within a system that you once couldn't make sense of. And the next step that you're going to want to work towards is getting back in touch with those core emotions and slowly removing the shame bind from them. So this can be done with the help of someone like a therapist or a support group who can help you have experiences of those emotions directly without that initial shaming environment. So finding places where you can express things like sadness or anger or excitement or attraction without being shamed in response. And the more we're able to do this, and the more we're able to get in touch with those core emotions that we have suppressed quite deeply for a lot of us, the more we're able to learn the appropriate skills for resolving those emotions. So someone like a therapist can sit with you as you experience your anger and help you figure out what the appropriate actions are to take to resolve that anger non-abusively. Or they can help you bring that sadness to the surface and help you understand how to move through it without getting stuck in it. And this is often a very long process because, again, these feelings are often very strongly repressed in us. So it can also take someone like an enlightened witness of whatever form to let us know things like, hey, you're saying that you're feeling, let's say, sad or depressed right now, but your physiology is very tense. You actually look pretty angry to me. Why don't we try that on for size? Why don't we try moving into the emotion of anger and just see how it feels? See if that feels more true. Or, hey, I notice that every time we get close to this topic that it would be very normal for you to feel grief around, you quickly change the topic and start talking about something more upbeat. I want to see if we can go to that topic and sit with that sadness for a little bit. And they're going to be able to help you contain these emotions so that you're now having the experiences you didn't have as a child. You learn this feeling comes up, we name it, and we start to find strategies for dissolving it and integrating it into our lives so that we can return to a state of emotional regulation. And now, as the day goes on, every time a feeling comes up, we're able to recognize it eventually, deal with it appropriately, and return to regulation. And this is how we eventually end up in a state where we are self-regulated adults. There is no world where we just don't feel anger, sadness, lust, excitement, joy, all of these emotions that are core to the human experience. Most of us experience them daily. And so if they are shame-bound and we're always pushing them down, calling them the wrong thing, and taking counteractions, we are going to be dysregulated daily. And it doesn't mean that we necessarily had something terrible happen to us. It just means a few things went wrong early on that caused us to internalize the wrong idea about our own emotions, and that now, on a daily basis, bring up this inability to regulate around them. This is what it means to have toxic shame. So the Coles notes on reversing this process is that we need to eventually get back in touch with the core experiences of those emotions, what they feel like in our body, how to recognize when, let's say, anger is rising up in me, how to recognize the difference between anger and selfishness, and how to work to resolve things directly rather than sending them underground into this convoluted system of giving ourselves comfort around the wrong things, where everything ends up kind of coming out sideways and making our lives harder and harder to navigate. This is the process of eventually reversing that downward spiral of toxic shame and turning it into an upward spiral of emotional literacy and emotional competence.